The trading post crouched at the edge of a prairie town, its splintered walls sagging under the weight of a late summer evening, the sky a bruised canvas of orange and grey, streaked with dust that danced in restless spirals across the empty street. Jacob, a rancher whose hands bore the scars of 48 winters and whose eyes held the shadow of losses he never spoke aloud, pushed through the creaking door, his boots trailing red earth from a 3-mile ride on a horse too old for haste. He came for flour, nails, maybe a tin of coffee, his jaw clenched against the murmurs of townsfolk who saw him as a ghost haunting his own life, a man whose ranch stood solitary against the endless plains. Inside, the air was heavy with the bite of kerosene, the musk of old tobacco and something sharper, desperation clinging to the shelves of dented cans and faded sacks. In the corner, half hidden by a stack of crates, sat a young woman no older than 19, her wrists bound with rope that bit into her skin, her swollen belly straining against a threadbare dress patched with uneven stitches. Sarah, though, Jacob didn't know her name, kept her gaze on the warped floorboards, her tangled hair falling like prairie grass over eyes that had learned to hide their fire. Her aunt, a woman with a face etched by hunger and a heart hardened by want, leaned against the counter, her voice a low rasp as she bartered with the storekeeper, insisting Sarah, 8 months pregnant, was a burden no one else would take, worth less than a lame horse but more than nothing. Jacob stood rooted, his fingers curling around the 2 silver dollars in his pocket, their edges worn smooth from years of clutching them like talismans against loneliness. He hadn't come for this, hadn't come to buy a life, but the aunt's words, sharp as a blade, offering Sarah as a wife to mend fences, cook meals, fill a bed, struck him like a gust of wind, stirring memories of a house too quiet, a hearth too cold. Sarah flinched at her aunt's tone, her hands shielding her belly, a silent vow to the child within, and Jacob saw the glint of a locket tucked beneath her collar, a small, tarnished heart she pressed against her chest as if it could anchor her. He spoke before reason could stop him, his voice low, gravelly, offering the coins, a sack of flour, and a promise of winter hay, not because he wanted a wife, but because he couldn't leave her to the saloon men whose laughter echoed in his mind, their hands too rough for someone already broken. The aunt's lips curled, a smirk of triumph, as she untied the ropes with fingers quick as a vulture's beak, muttering that Sarah better not make trouble, that she wasn't worth the price paid. Sarah rose slowly, her movements heavy with the weight of betrayal, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall, the locket trembling against her skin as she followed Jacob to the door. He didn't touch her, didn't look back, just nodded toward his wagon outside where his horse stood sweating, its ribs sharp under a coat dulled by dust. Sarah climbed up, her hands shaking, clutching the locket that held her mother's faded photograph, a relic of love lost to a childhood of empty promises. The ride to Jacob's ranch stretched through a sea of swaying grass, the wind carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, whispering secrets neither could voice. His ranch appeared on the horizon, a low house with a sagging porch, its solitude unbroken by neighbors or fences, only the vast prairie stretching to meet a sky that seemed to mourn. Jacob helped her down, his hands steady but distant, pointing her toward the door with a grunt, his gaze fixed on the ground as if meeting her eyes might unravel the walls he'd built around his heart. Inside, the house smelled of wood polish and absence, its single chair by the hearth worn smooth, a photograph above it showing a woman with gentle eyes cradling an empty cradle, its edges frayed from years of quiet touches. Sarah stood in the doorway, her breath shallow, fingers brushing the locket where her mother's smile lived, a reminder of a time before betrayal became her shadow. Jacob muttered that she could rest, that water was by the stove, his voice flat, but not cruel, and turned away, leaving her in the dim light of a house that felt like a memory carved in wood. Sarah's heart pounded, not from fear of him, but from the weight of being bought, of being less than the coins he'd traded. Yet, in his silence, she sensed no malice, only a man who'd forgotten how to hope, whose grief mirrored her own in ways she couldn't yet name. The ranch house stood like a lone sentinel against the endless prairie, its walls weathered to a soft gray, the porch creaking under the weight of a wind that never seemed to rest, carrying the faint hum of cicadas through the twilight. Sarah stepped into the room Jacob had pointed to, her bare feet brushing the cool floorboards, the air inside clean and heavy with the scent of beeswax and old cedar, as if time had polished the space but forgotten to fill it. The bed was narrow, draped with a quilt stitched in patterns of blue and gold, its edges frayed but precise, and on the dresser sat a chipped porcelain pitcher, a comb with missing teeth, and a pair of leather slippers, small and untouched, as if waiting for feet that never came. Above the bed hung a single photograph, its frame tilted slightly, showing a woman with a gentle smile cradling an empty cradle, her eyes bright but distant, like stars seen through a storm. Sarah's fingers brushed the locket at her throat, her mother's face a faint shadow within, and she felt the weight of being in a stranger's home, a place that held its own ghosts. She sat on the bed, the child within her stirring, and noticed a small sewing needle tucked in her sleeve, a remnant of her old life, now a talisman of caution she hid beneath the pillow. Sleep wouldn't come. The silence of the house too vast, too alive, broken only by the faint creak of beams settling under the night's cool breath. Unable to lie still, Sarah rose, her movements slow to avoid waking the floorboards, and crept. Toward the main room, the needle clutched in her palm like a promise of control. Through the window she saw Jacob on the porch, a lantern casting jagged shadows across his face as he knelt over a broken harness, his hands threading leather with a patience that seemed to defy the restless wind. He spoke softly, not to her but to the air, words she barely caught, something about a promise to keep things mended, his voice rough but tender, as if addressing someone long gone. Sarah stood frozen, the needle biting into her skin, her heart a drumbeat of fear and curiosity, wondering if this man's sorrow was a mirror to her own, a loss that lingered like dust in the lungs. She stepped back, retreating to the room. The quilt's weight a strange comfort as she lay down, the needle now tucked under the mattress, not out of trust, but because his grief felt like a language she might one day understand. The next morning, sunlight spilled through a single window, painting the quilt in hues of amber, and Sarah found a plate of cornbread on a stool outside her door, still warm, paired with a tin cup of water, no note, no sound of Jacob's presence. She ate slowly, the bread crumbling in her hands, each bite a reminder of her hunger, not just for food, but for something solid to hold on to in this unfamiliar place. The house was too orderly, its surfaces polished to a sheen, yet it felt hollow, as if it had been waiting for years to be filled with more than echoes. Sarah wandered to the hearth, where a single chair faced a cold fire pit, and noticed a small wooden box on the mantel, its lid carved with a delicate vine pattern, unopened, as if its contents were too heavy to touch. She didn't open it, didn't dare, but her fingers traced the carving, feeling the care in its making, and she wondered who had left such tenderness in a house so still. Outside, the prairie stretched endless, the horizon a thin line where earth kissed sky, and Sarah saw Jacob in the distance, his silhouette bent over a fence post, hammering with steady rhythm, alone but purposeful. She stayed inside, her hands resting on her belly, the child's kicks a quiet reassurance that life persisted, even here in this place of absence. The day passed in silence, not the sharp kind she'd known in her aunt's home, where quiet was a prelude to anger, but a softer kind, one that didn't demand answers or apologies. By evening, Sarah sat by the window watching the sky turn to indigo, the stars emerging like pinpricks of hope, and she heard Jacob's boots on the porch again, the lantern's glow flickering as he worked on something new, a gate hinge maybe, or a tool dulled by years of use. His hands moved with the same care she'd seen in the quilt, in the carved box, and she wondered if this man who spoke so little was mending more than objects, if he was stitching together pieces of a life broken long before she arrived. Sarah's fingers found the locket again, its clasp worn from years of clutching, and she whispered to it, not to her mother but to the child within, promising to find a way to be more than what she'd been sold for. The house, with its polished surfaces and silent relics, felt less like a cage now, more like a question, one she wasn't ready to answer but couldn't ignore. Jacob's shadow moved outside, steady, solitary, and Sarah felt a pang, not of fear but of recognition, as if his loneliness was a mirror held up to her own, reflecting a pain that might one day be shared. The late afternoon sun hung low over the prairie, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the cracked earth, the air thick with the scent of drying grass and a faint promise of rain that never came. Sarah sat by the open window, her hands busy peeling potatoes, the knife's edge steady despite the weight of her belly, now heavy with the child who kicked restlessly as if sensing the world's unease. Days had passed since she'd arrived, at Jacob's ranch, each one marked by quiet routines, bread left by her door, a kettle humming on the stove, a mended shawl draped over the chair, all gestures that spoke louder than his sparse words. She'd begun to notice the house's small details, a shelf of worn books, their spines creased from careful hands, a chipped teacup left on the counter, its handle smoothed by years of use, a faint scratch on the wall shaped like a crescent, moon, as if someone had once danced a child to sleep there. The silence, once daunting, had softened, letting her breathe in a way she hadn't in years, not since her mother's death left her with an aunt who saw her as a debt to be paid. A sharp knock shattered the stillness, and Sarah's knife paused mid-cut, her pulse quickening as Jacob's boots thudded across the floorboards to the door. A woman stood outside, her black bonnet framing a face lined with suspicion, her eyes, sharp as flint, mud caking her boots from a long walk across the plains. "Esther," Jacob called her, his voice even but guarded as if bracing for a storm he'd weathered before. She demanded eggs, her tone clipped, but her gaze slid past him to Sarah, lingering on her swollen belly with a sneer that felt like a slap. "So this is the girl," Esther said, her voice dripping with venom, barely grown and already carrying some miner's shame. "What's wrong, Jacob? Couldn't find a proper woman to replace your Mary." Sarah's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the knife, the blade trembling as Esther's words cut deeper, calling her a stray, a scandal, a stain on the town's dusty honor. Jacob stood unmoving, his broad shoulders a wall between Sarah and the woman's scorn, his silence louder than any defense he might have offered. He turned to the kitchen, retrieved a small basket of eggs, their shells speckled and warm, and held it out without a word, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond. Esther's face as if seeing a horizon she couldn't reach. Esther snatched the basket, her lips curling into a smirk, muttering that Sarah wouldn't last, that girls like her never did, before turning and stomping back into the fading light. Jacob closed the door, not with force, but with a quiet click. That echoed in the stillness, leaving Sarah standing by the window, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and shame. She waited for him to speak, to deny Esther's words, to say she wasn't what the town thought, but he only walked to the porch, settling into a worn rocking chair, his hands picking up a piece of cedar to whittle, the knife's slow scrape. The only sound in the dusk. Sarah's gaze drifted to the photograph above the hearth, the woman's eyes watching her, not with judgment but with a quiet patience, as if she understood the weight of being seen as less. Alone in the kitchen, Sarah set the knife down, her fingers brushing the curve of her belly, the child's gentle kick a reminder of her own resilience. She stepped to the hearth, studying the photograph closer, noticing the woman's hands, strong like Jacob's but softened by love, cradling a cradle that held no child. Sarah whispered to the image, her voice barely a breath. "He doesn't defend me because he can't defend himself, can he?" The realization settled like dust in her chest, heavy but clear. Jacob's silence wasn't cruelty, it was a shield, forged from a loss she could feel in the house's every corner. She thought of her own losses, the mother who sang her lullabies, before sickness took her, the aunt who traded her for coins, the lover who promised forever and left her with nothing but a child. Jacob's grief, though unspoken, was a mirror to her own, not a chain but a thread, thin and fragile, connecting them in a way she hadn't expected. She moved to the window, watching Jacob's silhouette against the darkening sky, his hands, carving slow, deliberate shapes, as if each stroke was a prayer for something lost. The prairie stretched beyond, vast and unyielding, but in that moment Sarah felt a shift, not trust, not yet, but a flicker of understanding that this man, who carried his pain in silence, might be as broken as she was, and that maybe, just maybe, broken things could still hold light. The night was a restless beast, the prairie wind howling through the gaps in the ranch house's walls, rattling the shutters like bones, the sky above a starless void that pressed down on Sarah's. chest as she lay awake, her hands clutching the quilt's edge. 2 weeks had passed since her arrival, each day softening the edges of her fear. But tonight the silence felt heavy again, not gentle but suffocating, as if the house itself were waiting for her to break. The memory of Esther's venom lingered. Her words a poison that seeped into Sarah's thoughts, whispering that she was still a prisoner, bought and bound, no matter how warm the cornbread or how soft the mended shawl. She rose quietly, her breath shallow, slipping into a heavy coat Jacob had hung by the door, its wool smelling of sage and sweat, a reminder of his quiet presence. The sewing needle, her small defiance, pressed against her wrist, tucked into her sleeve as she pulled on boots too big for her feet, their soles worn from someone else's steps. She moved through the darkened house, avoiding the creaky floorboard by the hearth, her heart a wild drumbeat as she stepped out the back door into the night's cold embrace. The air bit her cheeks, sharp and unforgiving, the prairie stretching. Into darkness, its grasses hissing secrets she couldn't decipher. She didn't know where she'd go, north to the river towns maybe, or west to where the mountains promised refuge, but anywhere was better than waiting for the silence to turn cruel. Her steps were slow, heavy with the child within, each one a defiance against the life she'd been sold into, but a sudden cramp seized her, sharp and deep, doubling her over near the barn's shadowed wall. She gasped, clutching a fence post, the wood splintering under her nails as another pain followed, fiercer, stealing her breath. The needle fell to the ground, glinting uselessly in the dirt, and Sarah sank to her knees, mud soaking her dress, her hands pressing her belly as if she could hold the child in place. "Not yet," she whispered. "Please, not here." A beam of lantern light cut through the dark, and Jacob's voice, rough with urgency, called her name, his boots pounding the earth as he reached her side. His hands, strong and calloused, lifted her from the mud, his arms steady as he carried her back to the house, the coat slipping from her shoulders to trail behind like a fallen flag. Inside he laid her on the quilt, his face flushed from the cold, eyes wide with a fear she hadn't seen before, not anger, but something raw, something alive. He knelt beside her, his hand hovering over her belly, then pressing gently, checking. For the child's movement, his voice low and strained. "Don't let their words take this from you, Sarah. Don't let fear steal your child." The word struck her, not as a command but as a plea, and she stared at him, her breath hitching, seeing not the man who'd bought her, but one who knew the cost of loss. Her hands trembled as she spoke, her voice a whisper. "My aunt wanted me to pour whiskey, to smile for men who paid for more than drinks. I said no once, and she locked me in a cellar with no light." Jacob's eyes stayed on hers, unflinching, as she continued, "I ran to a boarding house, scrubbed sheets until my hands bled, met a man who said he loved me until he didn't, left me with this child and no name to give it." The confession spilled out, raw and jagged, each word a stone lifted from her chest, and Jacob listened, his silence not empty but heavy with understanding, his hand still resting near hers, not touching but close enough to feel its warmth. He rose, stoking the fire until flames danced across the hearth, the room glowing with a heat that pushed back the night's chill. Sarah's pains eased, the child settling within her, and she lay back, exhaustion pulling at her limbs, the needle forgotten in the mud outside. Jacob sat by the fire, his back to her, shoulders tense but steady, and she saw the lines of his face in the flickering light, etched with a sorrow that matched her own. Not a captor, but a man who carried his own wounds. The house settled around them, its silence no longer a threat, but a space where truths could breathe, where pain could be spoken without breaking. Sarah closed her eyes, the fire's crackle a soft lullaby, and for the first time since her mother's death she felt not safe, not yet, but seen, as if her story, her child, her fear, were no longer hers alone to carry. The night pressed against the ranch house like a held breath, the fire's glow casting trembling shadows across the walls, its warmth a fragile shield against the prairie's endless chill, as Sarah lay on the quilt, her body still humming from the pain that had nearly driven her into the dark. The memory of Jacob's hands, steady and urgent, lingered in her mind, his words, "Don't let fear steal your child," echoing like a vow she hadn't expected from a man who'd seemed carved from silence. Sleep eluded her. the child within, stirring gently, as if testing the safety of this new quiet, and Sarah's gaze drifted to the hearth where a small wooden box sat, its vine-carved lid catching the firelight like a whispered secret. She rose, her bare feet silent on the cool floor, drawn to the box as if it held answers to the man who'd carried her back from the mud. The lid opened with a soft creak, revealing a tiny knitted blanket, no bigger than a shawl, its stitches, tight and careful, the pale blue wool faded but soft, as if it had been touched 1,000 times but never used. A sound came from behind, faint and raw, and Sarah turned to find Jacob in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim hall, his hands clutching the frame as if to steady himself. His eyes, usually guarded, were open wounds, fixed on the blanket, and he spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "Mary made that after the second, thought we'd have a chance to wrap a child in it." Sarah's breath caught, the blanket heavy in her hands, and she asked, her voice soft as the wool, "What happened? To them?" Jacob sank into the chair by the hearth, his fingers tracing the armrest's worn grain, and said, 5 times we tried, 5 times we lost, boys and girls, never drew breath, buried them under the cottonwood by the creek." His words were slow, each one a stone laid bare, and Sarah saw the lines in his face deepen, not with age but with a grief that had hollowed him out. She sat across from him, the blanket between them, and spoke of her own losses, not the ones she'd shared before but the deeper cuts. Her mother's songs fading as fever took her, the nights spent hiding from her aunt's fists, the lover who'd promised a home but left her with only shame and a child. Jacob listened, his gaze on the fire, its flames reflecting in his eyes like stars in a still pond, and when she finished, he nodded, not with pity, but with recognition, as if her pain was a language he'd spoken for years. The blanket lay in her lap, a relic of hope unfulfilled, and Sarah traced its edges, imagining Mary's hands, steady like Jacob's, weaving dreams that never came true. She said, "I want to name her Lily, my child, after something that grows even in hard ground," and Jacob's head lifted, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that night, a flicker of something soft breaking through his guarded stare. He rose, setting a fresh log on the fire, its crackle filling the silence, and Sarah felt the room shift, not warmer but fuller, as if their shared truths had carved a space where loneliness couldn't hold. The blanket went back into its box, but she didn't close the lid, leaving it open like a promise to remember. Jacob stepped to the window, looking out at the prairie, its darkness softened by a sliver of moon, and said, "Mary used to say sorrows, like a river. It cuts deep, but it carries you somewhere new." Sarah nodded, her hands resting on her belly, feeling Lily's gentle kicks, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a stranger in this house, not a guest, but a piece of its story woven into its quiet. The fire burned low, its embers glowing like small hopes, and Jacob turned back, his silhouette softer now, less like a wall and more like a bridge. Sarah stood, returning to her room, the blanket's weight still in her mind, and as she lay down, the house's silence felt different, not a void but a canvas ready for new colors. The next morning she woke to find a plate of biscuits on the stool by her door, a sprig of dried sage tucked beside them, its scent sharp and clean, a Esau gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed, but to Sarah it was a thread, tying her to this place, to this man who'd lost as much as she had. She ate slowly, the sage's fragrance mingling with the buttery warmth, and looked out at the prairie, its grasses swaying under a sky that promised light. Jacob was already outside, his figure small against the horizon, mending a gate with the same care he'd given the blanket's memory, and Sarah felt a pull not to run but to stay, to see what could grow in a place where sorrow had carved so deep. Spring crept over the prairie like a cautious guest, the air softening with the scent of damp earth and new grass, the sky shedding its grey shroud for a pale blue that stretched wide above the ranch, where the first green shoots poked through, the soil like promises kept after a long winter. Sarah stepped outside, her movements slower now, the weight of her belly a constant reminder of Lily's nearness, and she found Jacob by the barn, his hands wrist-deep in dirt, turning over a patch of ground where nothing but weeds had dared to grow. The days had grown gentler since their night by the fire, the shared weight of their losses weaving a thread of understanding that didn't need words, and Sarah no longer waited for Jacob to leave before joining him in small tasks, tossing grain to the chickens, hauling buckets of water from the creek, her hands finding purpose in the rhythm of the ranch. She noticed a corner of the yard, a barren strip near a sagging fence where the earth lay cracked and hard, and she knelt beside it, her fingers brushing the soil as she asked Jacob about the faint lines of old furrows, barely visible under years of neglect. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and said, "Mary tried daisies there, thought they'd take root, brighten the place, but the wind always won, scattering the seeds before they could hold." Sarah's eyes traced the patch, imagining white petals against the brown, and she suggested they try again, her voice steady with a hope she hadn't felt in years. Jacob hesitated, his gaze distant, but nodded, fetching a small sack of daisy seeds from the shed, their husks delicate as whispers. Together they worked the soil, Sarah's hands pressing seeds into the earth, Jacob's shovel breaking the hard crust, their movements slow but synchronized, like a dance neither had planned. The sun climbed higher, warming their backs, and Sarah felt Lily shift, a gentle nudge that seemed to bless the moment. By noon they sat on the porch sharing a meal of cornbread and stewed apples, the air filled with the chirp of sparrows and the rustle of new leaves. Sarah pulled a tattered book of poetry from the shelf, its pages yellowed but soft, and read aloud, her voice carrying lines about rivers and renewal, each word a thread tying her to this place, to Jacob, to the woman whose daisies hadn't bloomed. Jacob listened, carving a small wooden horse, its lines smooth under his knife, and admitted Mary loved those poems, used to read them at dusk, her voice like a song that made the stars listen. His lips curved, not quite a smile, but close, and Sarah felt her chest tighten, not with fear but with something warmer, something that felt like home. She spoke then, saying she'd name her child Lily, for flowers that grew where others failed, and Jacob's hands stilled, his eyes meeting. Hers, soft with a belief he'd thought long buried. The village had begun to notice the change, their whispers quieter now, replaced by small offerings, a jar of honey left on the porch, a knitted scarf folded neatly by the gate, gestures that felt like apologies for words too sharp. Sarah didn't ask about them, just accepted each gift, her fingers lingering on the scarf's soft wool, wondering who had woven it with such care. One evening, as the sky burned gold and purple, Sarah read another poem, this one about light finding cracks in stone, and Jacob set the wooden horse aside, his voice low as he said Mary believed in stubborn things, like daisies, like love, even when the ground said no. Sarah nodded, her hand on her belly, feeling Lily's strength, and said, maybe she was right. Maybe stubborn things just need time. Jacob looked at her then, his face softer, less like the man who'd stood silent against Esther's scorn, more like someone remembering how to hope. They worked on the daisy patch in the days that followed, Sarah watering the soil, Jacob building a low windbreak from scrap wood, their hands brushing once as they reached for the same stake, a touch neither acknowledged but both felt. The prairie seemed to watch, its winds gentler now, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Sarah stood one afternoon, her back aching but her heart light, and saw a single green shoot in the daisy patch, small but defiant, pushing through the earth like a vow kept. She called Jacob over, her voice bright, and he knelt beside her, his fingers hovering over the sprout, as if afraid to break its fragile courage. He said nothing, but his eyes held a spark, a flicker of the man he might have been before loss carved him hollow. Sarah felt it too, a shift in the air, in the space between them, as if the ranch, the daisies, the unborn Lily, were weaving them into something new, not whole yet, but growing. The house, once a silent witness, hummed with small sounds now. Sarah's voice reading, Jacob's knife carving, the creak of the porch under their steps, and Sarah knew as she watched the sunset paint the prairie gold that she was no longer just passing through. The prairie turned restless as a late spring dust storm rolled in, the sky bruising to a sickly yellow, the wind screaming across the plains, carrying grit that stung like needles and shrouded the ranch in a haze that choked the light from the sun. Sarah stood at the kitchen table, setting out plates for a simple supper of beans and bread, her hands steady despite the ache in her back, when a gust rattled the windows, sending a fine layer of dust sifting through the cracks, settling on her skin like a warning. The air grew thick, tasting of earth and heat, and Lily stirred restlessly within her as if sensing the storm's hunger. Jacob burst through the door, his hat clutched in one hand, his face streaked with dirt, eyes sharp with urgency as he said, "Storm's coming fast from the west, we need to move. There's a cave up the north trail, it'll hold against this." Sarah nodded, her heart lurching, but as she reached for her shawl, a searing pain gripped her, low and fierce, buckling her knees until she clutched the table's edge, her breath coming in short gasps. Jacob was at her side in an instant, his voice steady but tight. "It's time, isn't it? The baby's coming." And Sarah could only nod, fear rising like the dust outside as another contraction tore through her, sharper, demanding. He didn't hesitate, grabbing 2 blankets from the hearth, soaking them in a bucket of water, wrapping one around Sarah's shoulders and the other over his own, the damp wool heavy but cool against the storm's heat. He lifted her, his arms strong despite the wind's howl, carrying her out into a world turned wild, the air thick with swirling sand, the prairie a blur of yellow and grey, the barn's outline fading as if swallowed whole. Sarah clung to him, her face buried in his chest, the blanket shielding her from the grit that stung her cheeks, each step jarring as another contraction hit, her cries lost in the storm's roar. The trail to the cave was narrow, lined with brittle sagebrush that snapped underfoot, and Jacob moved fast, his boots sure despite the wind's push, his breath ragged but unwavering as he whispered, "Hold on, Sarah, just hold on." The cave loomed. Ahead, a low gash in the hillside, its stone walls cool and ancient, a refuge carved by time itself. Jacob kicked the door open, a crude slab of wood, and set Sarah down on a bed of straw, the air inside heavy with the scent of damp rock and moss. He lit a small oil lamp, its flame flickering but steady, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the walls. Sarah's pains came faster now, each one a wave crashing over her, and she gripped Jacob's hand, her nails digging into his palm as she gasped, "I'm scared. I can't do this. Not here. Not now." Jacob knelt beside her, his face close, his voice low and firm. "You're stronger than this storm, Sarah. You're not alone. I've seen loss. I won't let it take you or her." His words anchored her, his hand a lifeline as she pushed through. The pain, her body trembling, sweat mixing with the dust on her skin. The storm raged outside, its howl muffled by the stone, but inside time blurred. Minutes or hours lost in the rhythm of Sarah's cries and Jacob's steady presence, his hands wiping her brow with a damp cloth, his voice guiding her through each breath. He spoke of Mary, not to mourn but to strengthen, saying she fought like you, never gave up even when the world did, and Sarah clung to that, her fear giving way to a fierce will to bring Lily into the world. Then, in a moment that felt both endless and sudden, a new cry pierced the cave, high and fierce, not Sarah's but Lily's, a wail that cut through the storm's fury like a blade. Sarah collapsed back, her body shaking, tears streaming, as Jacob wrapped the tiny, squirming girl in the damp blanket, his hands trembling but gentle, his eyes bright with something beyond relief. He handed Lily to Sarah, her skin warm and slick, her cries softening as she nestled against her mother's chest, seeking milk, seeking life. Sarah laughed, a sound raw and broken, and whispered, "Lily, you're here. You're mine." Her voice a prayer answered in the dark. Jacob sat back, his shoulders sagging, his hands stained with dust and blood, and for a moment he looked at Lily, then at Sarah, his face softened by a wonder that seemed to mend something broken inside him. The storm outside began to falter, its roar fading to a low moan, the dust settling as slivers of moonlight crept through the cave's cracks, painting Lily's face in silver. Sarah held her daughter close, her heart full, her fear burned away by the miracle in her arms, and Jacob stayed near, his silence no longer a wall but a promise, a vow to protect this new light born in the heart of ruin. A year after the dust storm, the ranch hummed with life, its rebuilt fences wrapped in morning glory vines, their purple blooms catching the dawn's light, the prairie stretching green under a sky generous with blue. Sarah stood on the porch, Lily on her hip, the toddler's curls bouncing as she giggled at a kitten, clutching a wooden spoon Jacob carved, its handle smooth for her tiny hands. The daisy patch bloomed, sparse but stubborn, white petals defying the hard earth, a nod to Mary's dream now rooted in Sarah's care. The house, once silent, sang with warmth, bread baking, fires crackling, the scent of sage blending with apple blossoms from a new sapling. Sarah's belly was round again, a new child stirring, her heart light with the strength the prairie had woven into her. Jacob mended a rag doll nearby, his needle steady, his face softer, lines eased by Lily's laughter. Neighbors visited now, their gifts, jam, booties, a child's note apologizing for old cruelties, piling on the porch, their voices filling evenings with stories of harvest and hope. Sarah poured coffee, her smile easy, welcoming the town's change. One morning Lily toddled to the daisies, plucking one with a squeal, her eyes bright as she held it up to Sarah. "You called him Pa yesterday," Sarah teased. "Twice, I counted." And Jacob, fixing a fence post, grinned, a spark of youth in his eyes. "She's clever, like her ma," he said, and Sarah's chest ached with joy, saying, "She's ours," meaning every shared moment. Jacob touched Lily's curls, his voice soft. "Ours, a vow beyond blood." That evening, Lily chased a butterfly, a daisy, behind her ear, her laughter rising with the wind. Sarah watched, hand on her belly, feeling the new child's kicks, a promise of more light. Jacob stood close, his presence steady, the prairie alive around them, its scars softened by green. The cradle by the window, cedar carved, waited for the next child, its rockers whispering of lullabies. Sarah whispered to Jacob, "Some things break to make room for miracles," her voice sure. He nodded, watching Lily rise after a stumble, her, daisy waving like a flag. The horizon stretched wide, forgiving, and Sarah felt her past, betrayal, loss, lift like settled dust, leaving this family, this home, where love bloomed like daisies in hard ground.